You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Caleb Gardner of the University of Tasmania in Australia. He's the head of the Centre for Fisheries and Aquaculture in the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies at the university. I'm really excited to learn more about his research on fisheries from the disciplines of both economics and biology. So thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to get a chance to learn a little bit more about your work. But first of all, could we quickly start off by having you introduce yourself and your past work?
My name's Caleb Gardner. I'm a fisheries scientist at the University of Tasmania. We have a separate institute within the university called the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. So I started out as someone who was a biologist and very interested in the animals, and then as I was working in fisheries, I became more concerned about the way that the whole human system was working. And so I went back and studied economics as well. And so I'm interested in the decision making and the management processes and just the way that benefits flow from fisheries into the community.
Yeah, and that's really cool to hear about, especially when it comes to the intersection of biology, ecology, and economics all at the same time. And I guess I'd really love to ask you about some of the context behind how do all of these disciplines play together in fisheries, and specifically when it comes to fishing industries. Can we start off with the economics? So how significant are the fishing industries to the economics of countries like Australia?
Well, it's very variable. So in the Australian region, we're well connected and we're aware of all the other smaller nations to the east of us around the Oceania region as well. So these are all small island nations. Now they're great examples of where fishing is incredibly important. So, I mean, places like Solomon Islands or Vanuatu, Fiji, these small island nations have got large fishery resources, and so they have very large impact on their economies. For Australia, fishing generally isn't so important. Around Australia wide, it's not particularly important industry. Where I work, where I live in Tasmania, which is right down the southeast of the country, we're a small state. We don't have a very large population, only 500,000 people or so, but we do have a lot of seafood industries. And so, in fact, around a third of Australia's seafood production comes from around Tasmania. And so, where I live, seafood production is a big deal. And that seafood production is a mixture of fishing and also aquaculture as well. So, it varies from region to region. Look, in fact, if I could just go back a second too, just to Oceania. So a really great example there actually would be Tokelau. So that's just a tiny island nation, but they effectively auction off the rights to fish in that country, particularly for their tuna resources. And so that income pays for essentially all their public services. All the schools and hospitals and so on are completely reliant on that income. So for some regions like that, incredibly important.
It's really interesting to hear about that perception of the fishing industry, especially for people who aren't maybe as specialized in the details of the fishing industry. Oftentimes, the only time we hear about it is really when things go wrong, when we hear about problems like overfishing and the impacts that the fishing industry has on the environment. But it's really interesting to hear about, all of these other benefits that people don't as often hear about. But when it comes to the other side of fishing, how does the fishing industry affect the environment of the marine ecosystems around Oceania and in terms of the individual species even? Do we see any positives, any negatives? What are some common impacts there?
Again, highly variable from fishery to fishery and region to region. But it's interesting. I go over to Indonesia fairly regularly as well, and just the perception of fisheries there is so different from in Australia as well. So in Australia, we actually have very light levels of fishing effort, and the impact on the ecosystem for most species is very small. Indonesia has got very high levels of fishing effort, and so for a lot of the species, they're just so heavily fished. So there's quite profound impacts on the ecosystem. And on the size structure of all the fishes that are being harvested. Still incredibly productive. Indonesia is just in fact, a really great example. It's just incredibly productive, the amount of fish that are removed, but interesting as well. Just the dialogue in the community there is very different in the sense that it's a poor country. They need to produce a lot of food to feed the large population, and so seafood, all the science, the fishery science over there, is the dialogues all around how can we feed our people better and how can we try to reduce poverty in coastal areas through our seafood industries. Whereas in Australia, a wealthier country, the dialogue tends to be more around how can we make sure that we've still got nice recreational opportunities, and that if we go snorkeling and diving in coastal areas, we're still diving in an area that's fairly pristine. So it's quite a different sort of dialogue. But in terms of your comment about what sort of impacts do fishing have, well, highly variable. So I do a lot of work on one species here called abalone. So they're a large snail. Now they're harvested by diving. We have some parts of the abalone fishery that are quite depleted in terms of the abalone stock, but in terms of ecosystem impacts, almost negligible. I mean, you couldn't have something that's more benign, really, just divers swimming down, using a knife to lever the abalone off the rocks and put them in a bag. Now, provided we get the catch limits right, which we don't always do in abalone, but if we limit the catch right, that's a very benign fishery. At the other extreme, I've done some work as well on deep sea trawling, and this is on, so we have some areas. Now, trawling generally around Australia covers a very small area, but in some of the places we've worked on, which the habitats are particularly sensitive, and in those little patches, we can see that trawling is clearly having a fairly profound impact on the ecosystem. So quite a mixed bag. It depends which region you go to. But the other point about Indonesia, this is where nothing in fishery science is ever easy. So Indonesia's got a fairly impacted ecosystem because of fishing. But if you stop that fishing pressure, what's the consequence? It means less food for large numbers of people who really don't have a whole lot of other choices on where they get their protein from. So not easy.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's very interesting to think about, already starting to see all of the complexity involved in terms of not only the difference between countries, especially with the examples you highlighted about, developed versus developing countries right now have very different priorities, but also within countries. It's really interesting to think about, the different species that are impacted and how that correlates with, how do we harvest different species. But to push you on this point, you talked about how you specifically study one species in your research. And I was wondering, when it comes to these species, is it often that we see research into them because they're, easy to study? Or is it that oftentimes we choose to study, say, keystone species that we can tell a lot about ecological health as a whole based on the health of these species?
Well, let's see, we certainly study a very small proportion of the number of species that are in the sea, that's for sure. And the species which we do tend to work on or look at in detail, obviously it's the ones which have got, which are worth most. So the abalone that I mentioned, we work on those because that's one of our largest fishery. Rock lobster, which I've done most of my research on over the years, has been for the same reason as well, just a highly valuable fishery. So we have this small number of highly valued species that we study in great detail, but the vast number of the rest of them really don't get much of a look at unless there's some particular reason ecologically. So you mentioned keystone species, so that's spot on. There are animals like that we look at in more detail because we need to understand them. But to be honest, even keystone species would still never get the level of research effort as an animal that is worth a lot of money for a commercial fishery. I think that's just the demand for information on a commercial species got to be much higher. We need to know levels of growth and production and how the stock is changing from year to year rather than and we need that sort of information for setting catch limits. Whereas ecological research, we're generally dealing with more conceptual information rather than needing to track things on a year by year or even month by month or day by day basis in the case of prawn fisheries. Yeah, so no question our research effort is concentrated on those high value species and on fish species rather than the same level of detail on an ecological species of ecological interest. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples of those on ones where things can be going on and we don't necessarily follow them. So we have an interesting species at the moment, which we're sort of discussing around the virtual tea room, if you like, which is spider crabs. Now, you'd probably be aware of what a spider crab is, but we have a species in Australia which is pretty large. So the bodies of most of them are around the size of a I guess, size of a softball, but then really long legs as well. So their legs would be they'd hang over the sides of a dinner plate. So quite a large animal, but they aggregate in just massive, large numbers as well. So thousands of them, and they build up into these aggregations in Australia. Sometimes that might be a metre or two deep, and covering areas of size of a tennis court. So incredibly interesting animal just to see if you're snorkeling or diving, and they can form these large aggregations, and they're clearly important to the ecosystems as soft sediments. Now they've become topical just in the last year or so, but it's been interesting in the sense that we've got this animal that is really abundant, and yet we've actually done very little research on them. It is not until now, when people have started catching that, we've started to wonder what are all their seasonal patterns and how fast they grow and how long do they live. Where are the larvae produced, and all these sort of really interesting, important questions that no one's ever examined them before. So to me, that's a really great example of how there can be animals that are important in our ecosystems, but we still know so little about. Still lots to be done.
It seems really interesting to think about,
Yeah.
the expanse of research which is still possible in this topic, given, what we do know versus how much you talked about that there still is to discover. And when it comes to the incentives here, I know you've done research into economics, and that's, somewhat rare in terms of people who know about both of these disciplines, economics and biology. So I'd love to ask you a little bit more about that, because you've been hinting at, the incentives for research in the industry, given a commercial fishery, their incentives for research are to make themselves more profitable and be able to figure out how to better harvest these species. Could you talk a bit more about, the specifics of the ideas we like to study when it comes to marine species and their ecosystems that can help us to benefit from those in terms of human applications, such as how we manage fisheries?
That's right. So certainly it's quite obvious that the commercial industry, their incentives are to try and make money. That's why they exist. But of course, in fisheries, we've got this interesting system where most of the controls are on how much production is produced comes from the government. So if you think about it, there's not many other industries in our economy which operate like that. If you want to set up a coffee shop, you can set up a coffee shop, and there's no one telling you how many cups of coffee you can produce and what size those cups of coffee need to be. But all those sort of regulations exist with fisheries, and because it's the government's role to set those sorts of limits, and that's because it's a public resource. Just all the sort of dynamics on the way that businesses operate and the way the decisions are made are really different in fisheries. And so this leads on to a lot of the interesting challenges in fisheries as well. And as an economist, I often find I sort of see things in reverse to some of the other biologists around. I can give you one example there where there's, you started this discussion talking about the way we hear a lot about overfished stocks and what a problem that is. Now, there's no question an overfished stock is a problem. Economically, well, in fact, a lot of times when we talk about overfishing or you read about overfishing the media, it's often portrayed as a conservation problem. Now, that's not really the case in most fisheries. Generally, when we talk or we hear about percentages of, say, a quarter of the world's fish stocks are overfished, there's no conservation risk there. These species are not going to go extinct. What has happened though, is that we've lost an opportunity of making better use of public resource and feeding the world better and having less impact on the ecosystem than what we needed to. So in some ways, they're all sort of economic issues. And when I hear about a quarter of the world's stocks being overfished, another way you can frame that economically, they're all actually opportunities. That means that a quarter of the world fish stocks now are not being as productive as what they should be if we could manage them better. So if we were talking about a private operation, in my coffee shop example as well, you could look at a coffee shop and say this coffee shop is not being managed to its full potential, where we're doing something wrong in the business. That's exactly the same problem we've got when a fish stock is classed as being overfished. Something's being managed badly about this stock, and if we did things better, then we'd be able to have a more productive fishery. We'd be able to feed the world better, and perhaps we'd be able to use less fishing effort to catch the same amount of fish. That might mean less fuel and therefore less gas emissions and all these other sorts of positive benefits. So to sort of wrap that up, the point is that economically, a lot of sort of problems that we see in fish stocks actually can be opportunities if we frame them in an economic form. And so that's a good thing. It means that, well, it's a good thing provided we can be optimistic, or provided we actually got some power to do anything about it. So if we can really try addressing overfishing, then we've got opportunity for, in fact, catching more fish. Each one of those fish stocks that are overfished, they are stocks at the moment that are not producing to their potential because they've been too heavily depleted in the past. That's the sorts of issues I'm interested in economically, and combining that with fisheries as well. Aside from that, look, I'll just seed a thought to take this a step further as well. But one of the other things about economics in fisheries as well is, so in a coffee shop, that coffee shop is owned privately, and I'm quite comfortable if a coffee shop makes a lot of money, and because they're doing it off their own bat. In fisheries, it's a different matter, where what we're dealing with is a public resource. And so I'm personally very concerned that when we have a fishing resource, or a business is generating a lot of economic yield from a public asset, that the public is also a beneficiary of that asset. And a beneficiary not just through access to food, but also that they get some of the economic benefits from those fisheries as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to
Yeah.
hear, first of all, about all of the different interactions between the stakeholders that you described in terms of, for a private corporation to be able to make money, well, they're heavily reliant on the government in terms of the policies they decide to put up. And also the government is reliant on these fisheries to get the right data to be able to make those decisions in the first place, and then how the role of researchers is involved in that, and how even for ordinary consumers, how they should care about the public resources in their own country. I think that really stood out to me. But then another thing that
Yeah.
seemed very interesting to me was, it's very cool actually to hear you describe this issue from an economic standpoint. It's very important in terms of how you often hear about the environmental aspects of this issue from most biologists. So it seemed to me that there was this aspect of, present versus future in terms of how, from an economic standpoint, if we're doing something to mismanage these fisheries right now, well, they're not as productive as they could be, but the emphasis is on how we can change about the decisions we're making so that we can unlock more productivity in the future. And then also, you talked about how, for the past 30 years, we've seen these trends and those trends. I'd love to ask you about that for a second in terms of, in the past few decades, what are the major challenges that we've started to see that are coming about in how we manage fisheries? What have been the solutions that have helped us unlock more economic productivity? And how do these trends kind of paint a picture of what is to come within the next 5 years?
I'll start with some trends, and not all these trends are necessarily positive, but at least they set the landscape. So let's see. So we've seen some of the big trends that we've been seeing over the last 20, 30 years around fisheries would be certainly much better information collection on fisheries. That's one of the reasons that's contributed, I think, to more fish stocks, or just a better clarity around how many fish stocks we have that are overfished versus being well managed or underexploited. So certainly better data collection. There's also been a trend to more recreational fishing, and that's it, depending on regions, of course. But certainly around Australia, we've got a growing importance of the recreational fishing, and probably a declining importance of commercial fishing in some areas. I think that's probably a global trend. And that's been very much driven by just an incredible rise in production from aquaculture production. So this is fish farming and other sorts of marine farming. So just extraordinary growth in production of seafood from farms. That's naturally has pumped more product into a marketplace. In fact, so product growth through aquaculture has been at around 4 times the rate of increased demand from population growth. So we're actually producing way more fish per capita than globally than what we were doing 20 or 30 years ago. That's having all sorts of interesting patterns. So one of those patterns would be, or impacts would be, more consumption per capita. So that's a good thing. People are getting more seafood, but it's also having interesting dynamics. And so some wild catch sectors are perhaps struggling because there is so much more competition now of increased production from other areas. So prawn fisheries would be a good example of that. The price of prawns has been declining substantially through time just because there's effectively a glut of production through so much farming nowadays. So that's been an interesting trend. In terms of managing fisheries as well, there's been an increased shift towards something which we call harvest strategies. So that's having a really hard set of rules around what happens. And so we set levels on what fish stocks we find acceptable or unacceptable. And if a fish stock declines to a level where the stocks are quite low, 20 or 30 years ago, that sort of situation might have just led to a whole lot of arguing and debate around what should be done. But if you have a very good, clear harvest strategy and a fish stock declines, what happens is normally already documented and agreed upon, and a fish stock declines and something happens, like the quota or the total catch for the stock is halved, or some changes are made to the fishing season or something. But importantly, something happens. So we've got a much more regulated space in a lot of fisheries today. A huge amount yet to be done in that space. That's a growing trend, but that's a very positive trend. There's been another couple of things I'd mention in what's been happening through time. One would be large sort of push particularly from conservation sort of side of things towards more marine protected areas. They're not something that I'm a big fan of, simply because they tend to be more about changing the places where fishing occurs. I'm far more interested in actually trying to regulate or limit the amount of fishing that happens. So to me, having a conservation strategy that simply just pushes the problem to some other part of the coastline isn't as important as actually trying to control the levels of fishing effort. But for better or for worse, marine protected areas have certainly become a big deal. And the last one I'd mention, though, as well, is just increased privatisation of our fisheries. So this is privatisation and corporatisation. So this is the process where a lot of governments around the world have shifted to something called quota management. They will set a limit on the amount of catch that can be taken, and then split that catch up into sort of shares, tradable shares. Those shares tend to be given away to people who are fishing in the industry, and in that process, what happens is this fishery has now become something that can be traded and owned in shares. So something that used to be a public resource has taken this step towards becoming privatised. And then if you have larger corporations who can buy up those shares, then the fishery takes another step and becomes more corporatised. So we're seeing this trend in many parts of the world away from what used to be sort of quite artisanal sort of operations with family level operations towards things becoming more corporatised. In terms of my concern about where benefits flow from fisheries as well, that means that sort of creates all sorts of interesting challenges where we now have a lot of fisheries that can be highly profitable, can be perfectly sustainable, and so are doing great in all sorts of ways. But in terms of the economic benefits, they may be lost from the community. So that can be a downside.
It's especially interesting for me to think about. Initially, like what you mentioned was there's a lot of variability between different states, the size of their economies and how dependent they are on any one industry, also like between developed and developing countries. So it's interesting to think about how those trends apply to the different places. And then in terms of, taking all of these mixed effects in the past little while and trying to extrapolate what this might mean for the future, what do you think are some of the positive and negative developments that we kind of are starting to expect in the next 5 years when it comes to the fishing industry?
Okay, so if I could just pick three, I think first of all, there's no question there's a whole lot of spot fires around the world of individual fisheries that really need things being done. So, in fact, earlier on in this discussion, I was talking about abalone. Now, abalone are an important fishery in Tasmania, in my area. And generally, abalone are doing pretty well, but we have some parts of the fishery that are overfished right at the moment, and they're a really serious concern. I'm sure any fishery scientist anywhere in the world will be able to identify some fisheries in their part of the world that things are not being done as well as what they should. So I'm actually quite positive around fisheries generally, but it's not hard at all to find individual stocks and individual locations where things need to be changed. And so it's just one of these places where we just continue to need good efforts and science and managers actually doing the right thing. So, and really, in order to get that done, I mentioned these things called harvest strategies before. That's something that's a bit dry. It's just this sort of process on how you manage fisheries, but that's something which I'm a really big fan about, actually getting the government to be really clear cut and to use some muscle. And when something needs to be done, they actually get in, roll up their sleeves and get the job done. And harvest strategies are just a great way of doing that. So that's that's would be one thing I think is really quite important going forward. There's this other issue about just trying to deal with ownership of shares in commercial fisheries as well, and so trying to ensure that some of the profits and some of the benefits from fisheries go back to the communities. There's all sorts of interesting things happening around the world in that space. Tokelau, I mentioned early on, I think just do it. It's a tiny nation, but they do things brilliantly well where they capture all the economic benefits and they turn that into hospitals and schools for the community. So that's just fantastic.
All right. I think it's very interesting to think about the future. And finally, I had one last question to wrap up with, and it's basically got to do with, it's very interesting for me to actually talk to someone who has the interdisciplinary knowledge enough to be able to look at these observations in fisheries and see them from both a biological and also an economical perspective. I don't think I've actually talked to any biologists that can actually empathize with the corporations and the governments and the challenges that they're going through. Usually, people are a lot more focused on the aspects of conservation and uniquely looking at the challenges that the environment is going through. But it's really interesting to see the nuanced way that you look at the fisheries given your perspective. So the last question I wanted to ask you was, given that you have this disciplinary knowledge in these two fields, do you think that is something that has greatly helped you in your career and has allowed you to see these issues from lenses that perhaps the colleagues around you that might exclusively study economics or exclusively study biology might not be able to?
That's a nice compliment, thank you. And I think it's true probably for any career actually, where I think and I think about this a lot now with my son who's coming up to his final few years of high school as well, and he has to look at different subject choices, and then looking forward to this amazing array of possible careers into the future. And I keep thinking around the way things are today in the world, where let's see, when I was going through university and high school, I think careers were much more clear cut. You could choose to be an accountant or whatever, and that you could do that degree or pick up a trade, and that would be fine. Nowadays, everything is there's so many interesting. The world is moving so fast. If you can combine different things and different skills, then that seems to open up different opportunities and people find their own niche. So I've been able to find my niche by pursuing things that are of interest to me. And I think it's probably a good recipe. Like I said, I think about that with my son as well. So he's interested in sport and interested in economics and other things. And so I try to encourage him to do everything, because I think all these things might come together into an interesting, unique mix. That might be a good recipe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really great advice for any of the young people listening in. So I
Mm.
want to thank you for this. Has been a really interesting discussion in terms of all of the nuance I mentioned. Also, we appreciate the advice you gave at the end, and also it's really cool to hear about all of the details of the world of fisheries in a way that often doesn't get talked about too often. So thank you for taking the time to go through this, and I'm really excited to see, how all of these different areas that we're learning about can compound so that we can gain new insights in a bunch of fields.
Thanks, Matt. It's been really nice chatting with you as well. Wasn't it great? Look, we can just sort of have these interesting conversations from other sides of the world at the moment. Such a pleasure. Thanks very much.